Ghost Fragment. The Last Word. I'm writing this from memory. Some mine, but not all. The facts won't sync with the reality, but they'll be close. And there's no one to say otherwise. So for all intents and purposes, this will be the history of a settlement we called Palamon, and the horrors that followed in all too brief peace. I remember home, and stories of a paradise we'd all get to see someday, of a city shining even in the night. Drifters came and went. On occasion they would stay, but rarely. We had no real government, but there was rule of law. Basic tenets agreed upon by all and eventually overseen by Magistrate Loken. And there you have it. No government, until there was. I was young, so I barely understood. I remember Loken as a hard-working man who just became broken. Mostly I think he was sad. Sad and frightened. As his fingers tightened on Palamon, people left. Those who stayed saw our days become gray. Loken's protection, from the fallen, from ourselves, became dictatorial. Looking back, I think maybe Loken had just lost too much of himself and his family. But everyone lost something, and some of us had nothing to begin with. My only memory of my parents is a haze, like a daydream, and a small light, like the spark of their souls. It's not anything I dwell on. They left me early, taken by dregs. Palamon raised me from there. The family I call my own cared for me as if I was their natural-born son, and life was good. Being the only life I knew, my judgment is skewed. And it wasn't easy, filled by loss as it was, but I would call it good. Until, of course, it wasn't. Until two men entered my world. One, a light. The other, the darkest shadow I would ever know. Ghost Fragment. The Last Word 2. The man I would come to know as Jaren Ward, my third father, and quite possibly my closest friend, came to Palamon from the south. I was just a boy, but I will never forget his silhouette on the empty trail as he made his slow walk into town. I'd never seen anything like him. Maybe none of us had. He'd said he was only passing through, and I believed him. Still do. But life can get in the way of intent, and often does. I can picture that day with near-perfect clarity. Of all the details, though, every nuance, every moment, the memory that sticks in my mind is the iron on Jaren's hip. A cannon that looked both pristine and lived in, like a relic of every battle he'd ever fought hung low at his waist, a trophy and a warning. This man was dangerous, but there was a light about him, a pureness to his weight, that seemed to hint that his ire was something earned, not carelessly given. I'd been the first to see him as he approached, but soon most of Palamon had turned out to greet him. My father held me back as everyone stood in silence. Jaren didn't make a sound behind his sleek racer's helmet. He looked just like the heroes in the stories, and to this day I'm not sure one way or the other if the silence between the townspeople and the adventurer was born of fear or respect. I like to think the latter, but any truth I try to place on the moment would be of my own making. As we waited for Magistrate Loken to arrive and make an official greeting, my patience got the best of me. I shook free of my father's heavy hand and made the short sprint across the court, stopping a few paces from where this new curiosity stood, a man unlike any other. I stared up at him, and he lowered his attention to me, his eyes hidden behind the thick tinted visor of his headgear. My sight quickly fell to his sidearm. I was transfixed by it. I imagined all the places that weapon had been, all of the wonders it had seen, the horrors it had endured. My imagination darted from one heroic act to the next. I barely registered when he began to kneel, holding out the iron as if an offering. but my eyes locked onto the piece, mesmerized. I recall turning back to my father and seeing the looks on the faces of everyone I knew. There was worry there, my father slowly shaking his head as if pleading with me to ignore the gift. I turned back to the man I would come to know as Jaren Ward, the finest hunter this system may ever know, and one of the greatest guardians to ever defend the Traveler's Light. And I took the weapon in my hand, carefully, gently, not to use, but to observe, to imagine, to feel its weight and know its truth. That was the first time I held Last Word, but unfortunately, not the last. Ghost Fragment, The Last Word 3. It was the 4th night of the 7th moon, 9 rises since any sign. The trail wasn't cold, but lukewarm would have been an exaggeration. Jaren had us holed up by a ravine. The heavy wood along the cliff's edge caught the wind, holding back the cold, and the rush of water muffled our conversation. We'd seen dual skiffs hanging low as they cut through the valley. It wasn't known Fallen territory, but anymore that's a dangerous assumption. There were 6 of us back then. 3 less than 2 moons prior, but still 1 more than when we'd first turned our backs to Palamon's ash. We took a rotation for watch during the night. Movement was kept to a minimum, and communication was down to hand signals and simple gestures. We could hold our own in a fight, but only the dead went looking for one. A hard truth that cut in direct opposition to our reasons for being so far from anything resembling civilization, much less our safety. The skiffs had spooked Kressler and Nada, and in truth me as well. But looking back, I think we were all just grasping for any good reason to turn back. Not because we would turn back, but because it seemed to be our only real hope, and I think we all knew it. Forward, where we were headed, into the unknown. And following the footsteps we were. It all just started to feel like a never-ending dead end after a while. Jaren never wavered, though. Not once. At least not to any noticeable degree. It was his drive, his conviction that kept us going. And it's hard to think on, but if I'm honest, it was his death that rekindled my own fire. A fire that was all but exhausted on that cold night. He seemed confident we were close, but more than confident. He seemed sure. No one else felt it. Our own confidence and any enthusiasm we'd had was set to wither soon as Brevin, Trin, and Mel were gunned down. The ghost, Jaren's ghost, never said a word to any of us. Just hung there, always alert, always judging. Not us per se, but the moment. Any moment. I never got the sense it thought of us as lesser, more that it was guarded, wary. We knew it could speak. We'd overheard them a few times. Just brief words, and no one ever pressed the subject. From time to time I caught its gaze lingering on me, but always assumed the attention was a result of the bond Jaren and I had. He was a father to me. At the time I didn't know why he'd singled me out as someone to care for, someone to protect. After all the loss I welcomed it. But looking back, taking in the arm's length at which he kept the others, I guess I should have known, or at least suspected there was more to it. We all woke that night, closer to morning than the previous day. A crack of gunfire split through the wood, then more, far off but near enough to pump the blood. A familiar ring. Last word. Jaren's sidearm. His best friend. Then another. A single shot. An unmistakable echo calling through the night. Hushed. Cutting. One shot dark and infernal, followed by silence. We crouched low and quiet, listening, hoping. Jaren was gone, off on his own. Maybe we were closer than we'd allowed ourselves to believe. Too close. He'd gone to face death alone. I couldn't admit it, not at the time, but he thought he was protecting us. After such a long road, years on its heels, a trail littered with suffering and fire, maybe he just thought he couldn't take any more dead kids, as he called us. The echoes faded and we all held still. No way to track the direction, no sense in rushing blind. What was done was done. The cadence of the shots fired told a story none of us cared to hear. Last word it hadn't been, and somewhere in the world, close enough for us to bear absent witness, but far enough to be a dream, Jaren Ward lay dead or dying, and there was nothing to be done. Hours passed, an eternity. We held our spot, but as the sun rose, the others began to fade back into the world. Without Jaren, there was nothing holding us together, no driving force. Vengeance had grown stale as a motivator. Fear and a longing to see more suns rise drove a wedge between duty and desire. By midday, I was alone. I couldn't leave. I wouldn't. Either I would find Jaren and set him at ease, or the other would find me, and that would be a fitting end. Death marching on. But then, emotion. Quick and darting. My muscles tensed and my hands shot to the grip of my lead slinger. Then a confirmation of the horrible truth I had already accepted, as Jaren's ghost came to a halt a few paces in front of me. I exhaled and slumped forward, still standing but broken. The tiny light looked me over with a curious tilt to its axis, then shot a beam of light over my body, scanning me as it had done the very first time we met. I looked up, staring into its singular, glowing eye, and then it spoke. Ghost Fragment, the last word 4. Then, Palamon was ash. I was only a boy, my face caked in soot, snot, and sorrow. I'd assumed Jaren, my friend, our guardian, the savior of Palamon, would always protect us, could always save us. But I was a fool. Jaren and the others, only a handful, but still our best hunters, our hardest hearts, had left 3 suns prior, tracking Fallen after the bandits had caused a stir. The stranger, the other, arrived the following day. He rarely spoke, took a room, took our hospitality. I was intrigued by him, as I was when Jaren had first arrived. But the stranger was cold, distant, damaged, I thought. But I wasn't afraid, not yet. Only a child, I knew the monsters of our world to walk like men, but they were not. They were something alien, four-armed and savage. The stranger was polite but solemn. I took him for a sad, broken man, and he was. Though at the time I didn't understand how that could make one dangerous. As with Jaren, Father made an effort to keep me away from the stranger. It wouldn't matter. As the silhouette approached, fear held tight. The dark figure towered over me, looked into me, through me. He smiled, my knees weak, all lost. Then he turned and walked away, leaving ruin and a heartbroken, terrified boy in his wake without a second glance. I've been chasing that stranger's shadow ever since. Now, we stood silent, the sun high. Seconds passed, feeling more like hours. He looked different. He seemed now to be weightless, effortless in an existence that would crush a man burdened by conscience. My gaze remained locked as I felt heat rising inside of me. The other spoke. Been a while. I gave no reply. The gunslinger's sword, his cannon, that was a gift. My silence held as my thumb caressed the perfectly worn hammer at my hip. An offering from me to you. The heat grew, centered in my chest. I felt like a coward the day Jaren Ward died, and for many cycles after. But here, I felt only the fire of my light. The other probed. Nothing to say? He let the words hang. I've been waiting for you. For this day. His attempt at conversation felt mundane when judged against all that had come before. Many times I thought you'd faltered, given up. All I'd lost, all who'd suffered, flashed rapidly through my mind, intercut with a dark silhouette walking toward a frightened, weak coward of a boy. The fire burned in me. The other continued. But here you are. This is truly an end. As his tongue slipped between syllables, my gun hand moved as if of its own will. Reflex and purpose merged with anger, clarity, and an overwhelming need for just that, an end. In step with my motion, the fire within burst into focus, through my shoulder, down my arm, as my finger closed on the trigger of my third father's cannon. 2 shots, 2 bullets, engulfed in an angry glow. The other fell. I walked to his corpse. He never raised his cursed thorn, the jagged gun with the festering sickness. I looked down at the dead man who had caused so much death. My shooter still embraced by the dancing flames of my light. A sadness came over me. I thought back to my earliest days, of Palamon, of Jaren. Leveling my cannon at the dead man's helm, I paid one final tribute to my mentor, my savior, my father, and my friend. Yours, not mine. As I closed my grip, allowing Jaren's cannon, now my own, to have the last, loud word.